Okay, here's the third large window or panel in the church, which is found on the east side. Okay, in medieval churches where stained glass windows first got started, even the direction was symbolic. Normally in Europe, if you go to the great cathedrals like in France and elsewhere, on the east side, both the doorway of the church and the window was dedicated to Mary, because east was symbolic of heaven and the saints and all that stuff. The west end was always associated with death and judgment. So you'll see in these big cathedrals in Europe, the west end of the church usually had was a window, and the doorway was decorated with the final judgment. And that's what this is. This is kind of the final judgment. This is the resurrection and final judgment. But it's also what I would call an allegorical depiction, because it's a teaching. It's teaching us something about basically what's going to get you to heaven or what's going to get you to the other place. So what you have in the center panel, of course, you have the resurrected Jesus, right? He's there in his glory. He's come down. Look on the left and the right side, you see angels blowing trumpets, as well as one angel holding the word of God, or probably also could be the book of life. The saints, as the book of Revelation talks about, those written in the book of life. And then on the right side of the panel of the window is an angel holding a symbol of judgment. You see the weights, the measure that he's doing. That's in the old days, that's how they would weigh things. They would put something on one side of the weight, and then they would put on the other side little metal weights that would tell the person buying and selling how much did this weigh. But it also was a judgment of our souls being weighed. So that's what that is, eh? That symbolism up there. Now let's look down at the panels, the sections in the panels below. So what do you have? On the left side, you have saints and depictions of Christian virtue. So, for example, at the very bottom, there's a woman, and she is holding a staff. And then if you look across the side of the panel, you can see her hand sticking out behind this other saint, who is a type of a pilgrim. He's got a staff as well. Notice they both have staffs. And she's holding out a lamp that is lit. And she's a symbol of wisdom. Okay? She's lighting the way to Jesus. And the pilgrim there is looking up at Jesus. As well above, you see, again, probably Joan of Arc, or one of those saints, because she's wearing armor. Again, there's not a lot of symbol other than the armor. She's a woman. That would be my guess. And then in the center panel, again, you see various saints. Again, there's another pope. Okay? There's that beehive crown. That's a giveaway. Notice as well, there is an allegorical symbol at the side of Jesus on the left side of the center panel, and she's holding an apple, right? Guess what? That's Eve. She's a symbol of, the first judgment that was levied on human beings. She sinned, like Adam, herself and her husband Adam. They took the fruit off the tree in the garden, right? So she's there, she's depicted there saying, okay, that's the fall, now there's redemption, Jesus, right? She's holding it up, right? And then on the right panel, you see all the bad stuff. You see symbols of what we call vice. There's virtue, good things, patience, love, charity, all those things. Those are virtues we're supposed to imitate. And that's what the saints on the left side are sort of representing. They're reminding us that these people's lives represented the virtues. That's how they got to heaven. They lived a virtuous life. In fact, that's the absolute demand of the church when she examines the life of someone and declares that they are a saint. Is do they lived out in their lives heroic virtue? That's the one characteristic they're looking for, because virtue is the way to heaven. But on the right side, you see vice. Okay? You've heard that word before, a vice squad. A vice squad is a group of police that check out bad stuff like drugs and murder and all that stuff. So that's what you see in the right hand. So there's like a cave, and there's flames, and then if you look down below, there's a hand reaching up from the flames. That's the devil or something like that. So bad stuff, right? And then those people there are depicting types of vice, right? So notice that none of them are looking up to Jesus. They're all looking away. I think that's a symbol right there. There's a man, again, hard to tell, but he's reaching out for the hand coming out of the flame. So that's not good. And he's looking away, far away from Jesus. Okay? So it could be pride, right? Could be very well a symbol of pride. You see a woman, she's got musical instruments, and she's got like a green leafed crown, and she sort of represents the idea, the vice of frivolity and, you know, party on down, you know, waste your life and seek all the fun stuff in life instead of doing the stuff we're supposed to do, you know, care for others, etc., etc. And then next to her is a woman, she's got great big pearls on and long hair, beautiful hair, and again, she represents, again, that whole thing of, oh, look at me, I'm so beautiful, that's what life is about. Look at our Hollywood stars, right? I'm so gorgeous. And that's the goal of life for those kind of people, is their looks, right? So, and then there's this guy above them all, and to this day, I'm not sure exactly what that represents, but it does look like he has some sort of a harp or an instrument in his hands. Again, I've often thought about that. What is that representative? And my only conclusion that had come after many years being here is that, you know, sort of that instrument, that harp, he's kind of playing the music, trying to, you know, there's old stories from Greek mythology where people would play a harp or a musical instrument to lure people away, you know, into bad stuff and all that. So that is my guess. But he is also holding up his hand, like, above him. You can see his hand is stretched out. And it could also be that he's just saying, get away from me, Jesus, you know, that kind of thing. So it's very interesting. But as I say, every time I look at this window, and there's always something interesting I discover. For example, I remember one time, if you look at the center panel at the bottom, there's a monk. He's in brown. He's in a robe, his religious robes. But look at his right hand. He's got it outstretched, and he's holding the ropes, his cincture, that monks and nuns wear around their waist. And when they receive that cincture, when they make their final vows, the cincture usually has 3 knots in it. And the knots represent charity, chastity, and obedience. Or poverty, chastity, and obedience, excuse me. So I think that's kind of why the artist has depicted him holding out his cincture, because again, the virtues of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So all kinds of cool stuff like that in this window. There you go. Okay, we're on to our next window. This is again a window in the east section of the church, just below the window we just talked about, the final judgment and vice and virtue. And again, these windows have a sort of a relationship to that big window, and I'll explain why. But first, I wanted to mention, you know, again, our church was dedicated, this present building was dedicated in 1916, and they celebrated their first Mass in 1917. So 1916, the church was dedicated. If you go out in front of the church to the very front, and you go to the east side, you'll see a stone in the brickwork, the stonework, and it's called the cornerstone, and you'll see in Latin and the number 1916. That's when this church was dedicated, and then it took them a while to build it, and then they celebrated the first Mass in 1917. These windows were created and put in 1920, so it took a few years. And, you know, again, because they would have been very expensive, but also, you know, things took time to complete. And these windows were made by a company in Chicago called Munich Studios. So that's interesting, an American company that made these windows. In 1980, all these windows were evaluated as to their worth, and they came up with the figure $125,000. That's 1980. And so probably a lot more now. Again, typically as things get older, and if they're beautiful and stay beautiful, it's even worth probably, who knows, maybe $500,000 now. So pretty amazing. So they're really works of art. They're very unique. So this window here is dedicated, again, remember we just looked at the big window about the final judgment. So here is a sort of a theme based on this. This is a story from the gospel, which is called the rich young man, or sometimes he was referred to as the rich young prince. And so you see him, Jesus is talking to him, and he's on the right, he's in all the fancy clothes, not my exact color combination that I would have chosen, red and blue and all this stuff, but the symbolism, again, is there. He's very wealthy, he's got all kinds of fancy schmancy, colorful clothing. So he's there talking to Jesus, and if you remember in the story, he comes to Jesus and says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Keep the commandments." And he says, "Well, I have." Then he says, now this is interesting, he says, "But you lack one thing." And he says, "Go sell everything you have, give it to the poor." So notice Jesus is gesturing to a couple people on the left that are poor. And he says, "And then come follow me." So his particular vocation, Jesus was telling him, is give all that stuff up, the worldly life, and come and become one of my disciples. And you know, of course, the story tells us he couldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. And he walked away sad, it says. So, you know, again, based on the big window of the Last Judgment, here is a sort of a minor judgment reflected in the scriptures. You know, the choices we have to make, right? And sometimes those choices will determine our eternal destiny. So that's why this window is here. You know, it's get to think, people to think, hey, what kind of choices am I making? Are they good choices? You know, that kind of stuff. And then again, the backdrop is interesting. You see a city and mountains. And I believe, to me, that symbolizes the world. So the choice that we have, we're going to follow the world and what it says, or are we going to follow Jesus? Very good. Okay, here we are, next window, again in the west end. And again, remembering the big window is about the final judgment, virtue and vice, living a good life, how we get to heaven. And then this window is kind of connected to that, you know. And so how do we get to heaven? Well, with the help of the church, right? The church has been established by Jesus to help us to get to heaven. So the church as our mother, as our teacher, right? All that stuff. The church through her ministers, but all of us as well, the church helping each other get to heaven. So this is again another scene from the Gospels, and this is where Jesus says to Peter, "You are the rock." Notice Peter on the left kneeling. Look what he's kneeling on, a rock. Right? And Jesus is standing on a rock because he is the rock, you know, really. But Peter, Jesus says, "You are the rock." Petros in Latin means rock. Kephas in Hebrew, rock. It's a symbolic name. "You are Peter, and upon this rock, Peter, I will build my church." Notice Jesus is gesturing with his right hand up. What is it? What is it? A church. And it's a symbol of the church. So it's not necessarily a church we would say, "Oh, I know where that church is." Probably is no church that looks exactly like that. Who knows? But it's the idea of the universal church. So the imagery of that church depicted there is sort of, I think, intentionally done to represent all kinds of different styles and all that kind of thing, meaning, again, the universal church. So Jesus saying, and look at Jesus in his left hand, what does he have? Keys. And he's going to give them to Peter. Now again, did Jesus actually do that? Give him a set of keys? No. But it's a symbol. But he says that, "I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." We can go on and talk about that, all that. That's a symbol of stewardship in the Bible. You know, there's even passages in the Old Testament that talk about the steward. Steward was a very important person. He was the guy in charge of a city or a household or a castle or his master's wealth, and the keys were symbolic. They literally wore keys over their shoulders, great big honking keys, not like the keys we carry around in our pockets today, but these were big, enormous keys that would unlock the door to the city. That was a very important job. So to be a steward, right, was the important job you could get. And that's what Peter is given. He's given the most important job. You'll be my steward over the church, right? Notice behind Jesus are sheep, right? So remember later on in the Gospel of John, after the resurrection, Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? Peter says, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus says, what? Feed my sheep, right? So they represent the flock. We just had last Sunday, Good Shepherd Sunday, right? If you remember that, the Mass readings. Again, we are the sheep. And, you know, I think it's kind of neat. Again, they're hiding behind Jesus, so to speak. Like Jesus says, they hear my voice and they follow me. So that's what they're doing. And then you see the other two disciples or apostles in the backdrop, St. John and St. James, right? And then again, look at the background, the imagery in the background, trees and skies, blue skies, symbolic of heaven. And look at all the greenery around Peter and between Peter and Jesus. Again, look at the bottom, red flowers. Again, all that stuff, lushness, growth. That's what Peter's to do. That's what his ministry, we call it in the church, the Petrine ministry, the ministry of Peter. That's the ministry of the Pope. And the main job of the Pope is to preserve the unity and to continue to carry on and preach the message of Jesus. That's the main job of the Pope. And keep the church one and preserve the faith. Right? That's the main roles. All the other stuff the Pope does is good, but it's secondary. That's his main role, to preserve unity in the church and to teach and pass on the true faith. So that's kind of what this window symbolizes. Okay, now we're in the sanctuary of the church, and there are 4 special windows that were installed here in 1920. And typically when you go to a church, a beautifully decorated church like ours, you can go to the cathedral as well, is another good example. In the cathedral there are stained glass windows, St. Mary's in Lansing, and I always look at them when I'm sitting in the sanctuary for a liturgy there, because again, they are symbolic of sacrifice or the passion of Jesus. So for example, I believe if I remember correctly, at St. Mary's in Lansing, they have very beautiful stained glass windows there too. One of the windows in the sanctuary where the Mass is said is the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac. So again, there's all kinds of symbolism here. Here they have chosen to do 4 angels, and we call them the angels of the Passion, because each of them are holding an instrument of Jesus' passion. So the window you're looking at now, the angel is holding up the crown of thorns. Notice in his hands, eh? The crown of thorns. In the next window, we'll turn and get you situated there. The next window, you see that the angel is holding the scourge. Notice in his right hand, the lower hand, he's got the whip or the scourge that when they scourged Jesus with him. And then on the other hand, he's holding like a rod. They would beat him. That was pretty much typical Roman torture. They would beat people, they would scourge them, all that kind of stuff. So pretty awful stuff. The next window this next window, the angel is holding the pillar, and that's where they would have tied Jesus when they scourged him. So that is what that represents, is the pillar that they scourged Jesus in before he was crucified. The final window that you're looking at is the angels holding up a cloth. The cloth is called the mandilion, and that's an ancient cloth. You've heard of the Shroud of Turin, which is in Turin, Italy. That's why it's called the Shroud of Turin. It didn't start out there. But that's an image of Jesus as it was the shroud they laid over him in the tomb. Well, there was another cloth, and the Gospel attests to this, that was there on Easter Sunday morning, and the gospel says that there was a cloth over his head that was wrapped up in another place in the tomb. So there were two cloths, and this is what you see here. And of course, when you do the Stations of the Cross, one of the stations is Veronica wipes the face of Jesus, right? And of course, it's not recorded in the Gospels, that specific moment, but it's an ancient tradition. And often with those kind of things, you know there's something to it. There's got to be some kernel of historical evidence. And, you know, as archaeologists and biblical students and all this stuff and professors delve into all these things, it's very interesting that as they go along, they find out that, in fact, all these stories are true. You know, all these people, all these events, you know, there's good, solid historical, archaeological evidence that it's true. So there are accounts in the ancient Christian world of this cloth being displayed to the faithful and healing people and all this kind of thing. So this mandilion, you can see the angels holding up, and it's got the face of Jesus, because the tradition says when Veronica wiped the face of Jesus, took the cloth away, an imprint of his face was left on the cloth. So that's what that is about.